Hey, welcome to the City Rev Life podcast. My name is Robey. I've got my wife, Rebekah, here. You can see that we are social distancing 6 feet, which I didn't think husbands and wives had to do, but Rebekah insisted that we needed to social distance. I can't even sleep in my own bed right now.
We interact like this at home.
At home. She makes me keep 6 feet away from her.
How you doing down there?
And if that lasts longer than the quarantine, I'm going to have serious questions, okay? I am going to report back when they lift the 6 feet initiative. Anyway, we are here to talk about the idea of fear and isolation. And so it actually is kind of a heavy topic, but we've talked about this in previous podcasts. We've talked about, Pastor Justin and I did one on what scriptures to run to when we're dealing with fear.
That's right.
But Rebekah has been thinking a lot about this from a therapeutic perspective. So some of you who are part of City Rev know that Rebekah is a therapist. She's a licensed clinical social worker. And so she comes from a therapeutic perspective on this. And so we're going to talk about some scripture, but I really wanted to take this and kind of lean on Rebekah's expertise to help us think through when it comes to fear. How do we actually, how do we process through this and how we're wired, and understanding that kind of helps us deal with fears. And so, but fear it's not a fun topic.
It's not something that we typically enjoy doing or enjoy talking about. It's not the answer we give people on a Sunday morning where we say, hey, how you doing? I'm kind of fearful.
Yeah, full of fear and terror. How about you? We don't usually do that.
Yeah, we give our best answer. We're doing okay. I think maybe in this season, people are more interested or able to say, I'm doing okay. I'm nervous. I'm worried. I don't know that we are still eager to say I'm afraid right now. It's just not one of those really pleasant emotions that we like to talk about. So
yeah, and I think that they're at the same time, this is one of those seasons that we have heightened fears. We're afraid, obviously, health concerns. We're afraid, what if I get sick? What if someone I love gets sick? What if one of my children gets sick? We're afraid about, will I have all the resources that I need? Can I get the things I want at the grocery store? There's economic fears. What's going to happen to the economy? Or maybe someone's lost their job, or their job's been furloughed. How am I going to survive? There's a lot of things right now.
Or the fear of the unknown. We just don't know a lot now.
Yeah, exactly. Just the fear of the unknown. And so there's a lot of reasons that that we can be afraid. And so this is an important subject right now. And at the same time, I think one of the most damaging parts of this season is if fear and panic were to set in. And so this is an important thing to talk about. And you were telling me how discussing fear, actually, even though it's unpleasant, it's actually important.
Yeah, well, and especially in the context of isolation, because isolation can be an accelerator to fear. We talked about, that panic, and we certainly don't want to create a culture of fear, and the isolation can really breed that even more so. So ways that we can use fear to our advantage, both looking at it from just a cerebral standpoint and a research-based standpoint, but also just as a Christian and through the worldview of our faith is an important way to kind of commingle the two resources to really get a handle on our fears, identify them, and actually turn them and work them for our advantage, and ultimately God working them for our good.
So fear is something that is uncomfortable to talk about, but it is important. And one of the things we hope you walk out of this episode with is you can actually take feelings of fear, harness them, and use them to your advantage if you know how. Right. And Rebekah is going to walk us through understanding fear and understanding how to turn that back around for our advantage. So first of all, help us understand fear. How does fear work? How does it operate inside of us?
So we are all born with instincts or reflexes. When babies are born, they have these reflexes that we don't have to teach them. We don't have to teach them how to, suck or have a connection or a bond with their birth mother. That's just something wired into their genetic makeup. And similar to fear, there's a part of our brain that it's like a reflex. And I think God hardwired that into us for numerous reasons, some for good reasons. And so there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, which is not something we often talk about. We don't say, hey, how's your amygdala doing today?
Mine's at about a 5 out of a scale, I'd say. I'm a 5 on a
This is a little
scale.
window into our dark humor. Yeah. But maybe something that's a little more common or representative in our culture that we say.
And the amygdala is in the brain, right?
It is
We're
in the
talking about
brain.
that?
It's
Okay.
kind of in the middle part of your brain. The
So
lower.
I was like, am I missing it? I don't see it on my body anywhere. So
Oh goodness, no. And so we tend to phrase that in our culture as fight, flight, or freeze. So what is your response to fear? Is it you're fighting, or do you tend to flight and escape, or do you tend to freeze? And so that is stored in that part of our brain. And it develops over time, of course. But when that happens and we feel fearful, regardless of your response, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can experience all three in the same episode, or you can have a predominant one, more fight as opposed to flight, or vice versa. And so they are typically the untrained responses to fear. It's like a reflex that we have. And so when our fear response is triggered, and those are the three responses, what happens biologically in our bodies is our neurotransmitters are released and our stress hormones spike. And I think we can all say what that feels like. It's not a very pleasant feeling. It's a very tingly, very high alert feeling. And so it tends to manifest itself physiologically with maybe our muscles getting tense, or our pupils getting dilated, heart palpitations, a lot of the things that people don't tend to associate with feelings of relaxation or being pleasant. So
yeah, I think the fight, flight, or freeze. I mean, we can see that both in our lives, but I can even see it with my kids. So I'll chase them around. We'll run around the house, especially the older two, Scarlett and Nehemiah, and I'll hide. And then when they come around the corner, man, I will jump out and scream bloody murder. And sometimes I really get them good. Okay, and one just screams and just Scarlett will scream and run away. And sometimes Nehemiah screams and runs at me. I mean, it's just his reflexes to attack.
Yes.
And I'm not really sure what age is it no longer fun to be scared, but they are now getting good at sneaking up on me. And before it was I'd hear them on the other side of the room, let's go scare daddy. And it's okay, but now they're actually getting good and it's not fun anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, that fight, flight, or freeze, those instincts that we have, those are hardwired into us.
Right.
And when we're feeling fear, we feel it all throughout our bodies.
Yep.
And that's not something that's pleasant.
Right. And with the context of kids, we play those games and it's fun because ultimately they're in a safe context. Mm-hmm. And so that actually is good, and it's therapeutic because it teaches their brain, it trains their brain how to activate that side of their brain, activate that fear switch, and then immediately turn it off. And so it's constantly being activated and turned off. And it's creating neural pathways that teach them how to use fear in the context of finding safety. And so we as adults are also used to that and have experienced that. And then sometimes though, if that stays activated and we don't turn it off, that's when we start to see and notice and feel the problems of that fear being activated and staying activated longer than we particularly like. So
you're saying when we have extended times of fear, that's when, and our muscles have been tense for a long time, our heart's been beating, and we're just in a season, that way we can start feeling that in our bodies.
Correct. And that's important. Let that cue you that something's wrong. I don't feel safe, and let that cue you. And it may not always be a physical safety that we're feeling alarmed by. It might just be a psychological safety, a social or emotional safety. But let those things cue you. So talk to us maybe a little bit more into this season, because there's fears about the coronavirus, but I'm not walking outside the fight or flight mentality with the corona, is that the corona, and then I run away. But there are fears. So we can't see that. We can't see the coronavirus, and so that's a really good point, is how along the same spectrum of these fears is anxiety. And as anxiety is really a pervasive form of fear. And I think it's a little bit trickier and more subtle because a lot of times we don't see the triggers of fear. When you've just been in a car or avoided maybe a car accident or, were biking and just, avoided a pothole or something, you can quickly identify, whoa, that was scary. I almost fell or I almost got hurt. But sometimes with anxiety, we don't really see or feel or know the triggers when they're coming, and they begin to stockpile up on us. And then it isn't until maybe in our quiet moments or in our restful moments, or maybe we're more vulnerable in our sleep, that some of that starts to come to the surface. And then, whoa, that should get our attention. There's something wrong here. I've stayed busy all day, and that's been a distraction, but that's not a way to turn off our fear or our anxiety axis that's been activated. So, I know for me personally, I wasn't necessarily taking on the fears of the coronavirus at the beginning. I was trying to keep it sober-minded. But then I noticed when I did little things like grocery shopping, doing my normal routine stuff and seeing empty shelves and seeing things bare. And as a mother and as a female just wanting to nest and keep her home a place of safety, that began to trigger anxiety for me. And I was able to identify that, which helped give me some understanding, maybe not necessarily entire control, but some control of, okay, this is where it's coming from, but I don't have to stay there. And so I was able for me to take inventory. Okay, here's what's triggering that. Here's why, but here's how I'm going to turn it off, which we'll talk a little bit more. But anxiety is also on that spectrum. And I think it is seductive because we don't always know until maybe it's stockpiled against us. And then it feels larger than it is.
Yeah. So I think what's so helpful, what you're saying is, it's one thing if I'm driving and I have like a near miss with an accident, I'm like, oh my goodness, that scared me. And I'm like, I just need a minute, because it was like so close.
Right.
But with anxiety, it's invisible. And so it takes some introspection. It takes some moments where I'm authentic and honest with myself. Yeah. And it takes me needing to kind of stop and think, what am I afraid of, and kind of take inventory, which I think for a lot of us, we're afraid to do that, but it's important. I think especially a lot of times men, we don't want to admit fear. And so when we're feeling anxiety, we want to always project and really probably above anyone else prove to ourselves that we've got it, we're handling it. But anxiety, we've got to stop and be honest and use those triggers, because we can't turn the fears around into triggering something good. Like we can't harness those fears for good if we're not stopping and being real when we're seeing those triggers.
That's a good point. It's just taking inventory of it, and that actually informing you to then take the next steps.
Yeah.
So there's two sides of the coin to fear. There's a protective side. There's a God-given, the way that He fearfully and wonderfully made us. He gave us that instinct to cue us when we need to find a place of safety. For our kids, we want that to be developed so that when they're on the playground and they're approaching something that's far beyond their age level, we want them to be able to know to turn back around that that's not safe. And we count on that too when we're in a place that we maybe weren't safe or aren't safe, and we need to be able to take that cue as a way to get protected and to feel safe. So that is then an important side of the coin that we definitely don't want to turn off. Otherwise, we'd be walking into situations regularly that would not be for our good.
Yeah, I think about the leprosy. Leprosy. The problem with leprosy is it actually just numbs the nerves, so you're not realizing that you're hurting and causing trauma to your body, and so you're wounding your body because
without even knowing it.
Yes, and so. And a lot of times ignoring fear as an emotion is not necessarily a positive. It's almost like emotional leprosy because I'm not getting that cue. Like if I'm going to touch something hot and I feel the burn, it's uncomfortable, but it's cueing me to pull my hand away. And fear is the emotional equivalent of that. I'm entering something dangerous and it needs to be addressed. And so acknowledging the fear is the positive side. Is that
correct?
I got it?
Absolutely. That's a great point about just emotional leprosy. Being able to identify your emotions, believe it or not, is one tool you can use to combat that. And then triggering. What is triggering that fear is another tool that you can use. It seems simple, it seems silly, but it's very therapeutic, and being able to identify the emotions and the triggers behind what you're feeling. But the negative side is, we weren't meant to stay in a place of fear. We're meant to turn that off. Once that need is met, that activated state of arousal and stress is meant to be turned off. And so I think about it in terms of like a boiling pot. If you've, maybe the ladies can identify with this a little bit more, but if you've ever put a boiling pot on the stove and maybe walked away because it's going to take about 7 or 8 minutes to get that boiling, and you maybe got distracted or did something else and you forget to put the pasta in or whatever it is that you're cooking, and then all of a sudden you hear something that doesn't sound good, or you even smell something. And what tends to happen if you leave a boiling pot on the stove for too long is the water evaporates, essentially. It comes out. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. If
I leave most of the cooking to you for the safety of our family.
Okay. Well, if it's happened to me, and if you leave it on the burner even too long, what ends up happening is you get ring marks on the bottom of your pot. And if you leave it on really long, it can even seep through and get in the middle of your pot. And so what happens, you take that pot off and you're like, oh man, is it still usable? Probably, if it hasn't been burned through. But is it pleasant to look at? Is it just a constant reminder of you had a moment where you just completely forgot about it? Yeah, so it's kind of like leaving that switch on. It's like leaving a boiling pot on the stove for too long. It leaves an imprint. It leaves a burn mark imprint. And so when we leave our brains activated with a stress high, with the neurotransmitters and our hormones elevated at that state for too long, there are consequences. And so we end up needing to cope and cope quickly. And so a lot of times we go to the quick, what we think are, it's deceptive. We think the quick turn-offs for that switch. And so what it may manifest as an addiction, may manifest as a website, it may manifest as a rage or a temper. A lot of these coping skills that seem quick and easy and offer relief, but it's really a masked relief because it's not turning off the switch like we need to. And so over time, if that gets rehearsed and repeated over and over and over again, you kind of create like a 6-lane highway in your brain where you're trying to channel your stress and offload it through some of these unhealthy coping skills, and then that becomes the automatic way that we cope when triggered, as opposed to some of the healthier ways that I think we all ultimately want.
So let's see if I can recap that. You're saying fear is meant to be for a protective side. It's reminding me something's not right and needs to be addressed. Something's not safe or not healthy and needs to be addressed. And then the downside is if we don't address that, because it physically manifests in us, whether we're ignoring it, oh, I'm not afraid, I'm fine, I'm not stressed, I can handle it, or we're not stopping to admit what we're feeling, then that ongoing tension is causing damage to us. And then often at that point, we're not choosing the wise, healthiest ways to deal with it.
Cope, right.
We're choosing the, I'm just so stressed, I'm going to Netflix binge, or I'm going to, eat another pint of ice cream, or whatever it may be. Or honestly, those things could potentially could be neutral, but there's actually some things that are just straight up harmful, whether it's pornography or substance abuse or whatever it may be, or an affair, or an inappropriate connection on social media, or whatever it may be. There are some things that are just straight up painful. And so part of the importance of addressing fear is that we can then intentionally pick wise ways to cope.
That's so true. And it's deceptive because in the moment, it may offer you that off ramp. And so it feels like you're turning off the fear factor that's been activated, but it's just dulling it for a short season. And so what's happening in our brains, and this is going to sound a little bit therapeutically nerdy for a second, but just hang with me because it's a good, valid point that I think will guide and inform us to how we can use fear to our advantage. It's like that boiling pot. It's similar to our nerve endings. Our nerves in our brain and all throughout our body are meant to send messages. And when our fears are activated for so long, it's like the ends of our neurons get fried, and then they don't work properly. They don't communicate like they're supposed to. They don't function well. And so that's when we get into trouble, because we're wanting our neurons to send a message, turn this off, turn this off, turn this off. And we're reinforcing the unhealthy way of turning it off, which is not actually turning it off at all. So we're trying to create different pathways or heal the nerve endings that have been fried by these stress hormones being elevated for so long. We've got to, one, repair the damage that's been done, and two, create brand new pathways. But what's so encouraging is a lot of neuroscience research that's been done has shown that you can create new pathways in your brain. You can change your brain. You can shut down that 6-lane highway and create a brand new highway for how to cope and turn off your fears. But it does take a lot of strategy and time, a lot of effort, and it's not easy and it's quick, but it is possible. And I think that's what gives us hope, is that you're not stuck. You don't have to stay stuck, but you do have to retrain your brain on how to think differently and cope differently.
Okay, so you're saying we can get in bad cycles of going to the wrong things to deal with either fears that we're ignoring or fears that we don't know how to address,
right,
that we get in these ruts where we keep going back to the wrong ways to cope, but we can retrain our brains to be going to healthy things,
right,
to help really untangle those fears.
Right. And for some of us, because this is a new situation, maybe your issue isn't, oh, I've got this bad, or destructive coping skill that I'm trying not to do now. Maybe it's just, well, I don't know what to do now. This is a new territory for me. And so take hope that you are able to create a brand new way of coping, and that's going to give you a sense of just empowerment to know that you're not a slave to your fears. You can actually use them to work to your advantage. So
maybe talk us through, what are some of those practices then? What are some of those ways
Yep.
that's healthy for us to deal with fears?
Right. So research has a lot out there that's therapeutically indicated that we can do. And I think it's important to start with just validation and empathy, and just knowing if you're feeling fearful, or you're seeing signs of anxiety, you're not sleeping well, or you can't concentrate well, or you find yourself worrying more, or in the middle of your day, you're kind of checking out a little bit more than you used to, just having difficulty concentrating. That doesn't mean you're weathering this badly or poorly, or that you're wrong. Or even as a Christian, we can internalize that and saying, I'm a bad Christian because I'm struggling with sadness or depression, or I'm struggling with anger or grief or fear. It says in the Bible, do not fear, but I'm fearful. So what does that mean? Am I not walking with the Lord close enough? Am I not secure in my identity in Christ? I guess I could always do that better. I guess I could always pray more. There's always room to read my Bible more. And so I think we put on these religious activities for ourselves to try and gain control, and to try and make sense of, if I'm a Christian, then why do I still feel afraid? And so I think, something that we talked about in an earlier podcast is the role of shame. And shame is going to try and paralyze you, make you feel like you're doing all of this wrong or poorly. And, best practices show, instead of that, that's going to paralyze and cripple us. Find validation, find empathy. There's others that are feeling this way. You're not alone, and that doesn't make you bad or wrong for having those feelings.
Yeah, I think that I know that from a pastoral perspective, I know that you've seen that from as a counselor perspective, I'm sure. But as a pastor, I know that a lot of times I'll meet with a Christian, and you're exactly right. They're feeling guilt, shame, or defeat because they're feeling fear, anxiety, or whatever, and they're feeling like, because I'm stressed, because I'm afraid, because I'm doubting, that is making me I must not be as strong of a Christian as I thought I was. Right. And what I try so often to reinforce is the fact that you are safely admitting it, and you feel the grace, and you're accessing community to actually address the fact that you are, and being honest with yourself. That's not a marker of your spiritual immaturity. That is a marker of your spiritual maturity. And it's the person that's saying, no, I'm fine, I can handle it. That's self-sufficiency. That's pride. That's inauthenticity. That is self-righteousness. Those are not markers of a mature, seasoned Christian. It's a Christian that knows their desperate need for God, know their desperate need for each other, knows that are humbled before the Lord, knowing their shortcomings, that can say,
I'm afraid right now.
Yeah.
I'm doubting right now. I'm having my moments, and
Yeah.
can be honest, appropriately so, in a community. And so that validation and empathy, I think a lot of times we let a false sense of spiritual maturity get in the way of that validation and empathy.
It's amazing how even we can use our spiritual maturity or walk to even hinder us from the authentic process of working our faith out.
So step one, best practices.
Yep.
Admit to myself about my fears and my stresses. Admit within community to another godly, if I'm a guy, to a brother in Christ, if as a lady, to a sister in Christ. Admit to my spouse. Talk through those things, and be honest about those things. That's step one. And then receiving back validation and empathy. The last thing that we need then as a Christian is a lecture on faith in God. What I need is validation and empathy, and probably vulnerability. Hey, man, I get it. I'm afraid too. This was my bad moment, and that kind of empathy and validation is
so powerful.
Yes, instead of running to a pint of ice cream, stopping, picking up the phone, calling someone, talking it through, or having a sit down with my spouse and talking through it.
Right. So that combination of what you just described is so incredibly powerful. But there's other things we can do. You can obviously get your basic needs met. At the foundation for any other needs that we have really cannot be built without having our psychological need for safety met, our food, our shelter, a sense of belonging and love and connectedness. I mean, that is the foundation before we can reach potential in our gifts and our abilities. So recognize that, get to a place of safety, and then identify your triggers. What's triggering you, making you feel unsafe, even if you are not unsafe physically? Identifying those, that's important. Also, connection. We've talked about a little bit about brain chemistry and our neurons, and if they're fried too much because we've been in a state of fear for too long, how do we heal those nerve endings and create those connections again, so that the pathways in our brains can work quicker and more effectively the ways that we want to. And so connecting with other people, ironically, is an accelerator to that process. And I think that's one of the tricky things about being in isolation right now is we are asked to not connect with people and to create that distance. And so we have to fight a lot harder, to go on a walk 6 feet apart from a neighbor, or to create that Zoom call after the kids go down. I know for me, once the kids are down, to create a Zoom call, it's not that I don't want to, it's just I'm tired. I've been homeschooling, I've been with the kids, I've been on. And so if you can take some time with your spouse and say, hey, can you take an hour here so I can go do this, so that by the time the kids go down, I'm not so fried. I actually have something in the tank to give to a Zoom call and to a friend. I really need that. And being able to speak up for your needs and to be able to find ways with your roommates or your family, whoever you are able to have contact with, to take shifts for each other. So the connection is so important, human connection. It acts as an accelerator to creating those pathways that we ultimately want and need, and healing that too. Another one is just strengthening our coping skills, or what the therapeutic world calls our regulators. It's just, what do you do to self-regulate? How do you disarm that fear factor being activated, especially if you're by yourself or you're not really in a context where you can just drop everything and go do a 6-step plan on getting a place of safety. So there's so many out there. I'm just going to hit a couple. One is exercise. The physical and emotional benefits of exercise are well researched and really do a lot for your brain in helping heal it, helping create pathways, helping to cope well. That is so important. Another one is hydrating. Hydrating water, healthy food, protein is very therapeutic in helping your body be able to get what it needs to heal itself. And so staying hydrated, keeping a bottle of water in your desk, that is a regular part of keeping that in your rhythm, to keeping yourself in a healthy place and hopefully turning off your fear. Another one is safe and healthy touch. That is another one that we're seeing is going to really be affected by the distancing, because we're not touching people purposely, and we understand why. And so but it goes against what research says, that healthy and safe touch can be very therapeutic. And they have well research about, infants and children, that they need a lot of healthy touch to develop properly, getting that tactile sensation and pressure. And I think there's something, I don't know for sure, but there's something in research that says with adults, we need something like 7 hugs a day for maintenance, 11 hugs a day for healing. And I don't know for sure, but I've heard that kicked around in the community. And I don't know if that number is true, but I know that the basic principle behind it is very true. So
don't you forget that, Rebekah. Especially, I'm all you got right now because we're socially distancing from other people.
Yeah, and
so
our children. Yes.
I guess you got them too. Okay, that's fair. All right. So just the list is validation and empathy, and connecting is so key. And we've talked about a lot. Really, when they say social distancing, we're talking about physical distancing. Let's find ways to stay socially connected. Get in a small group right now at your church, and you can still sign up for one on the City Rev app. Get in one. They use small groups that are doing Zoom calls. I love that. I would love to be on the other end of this, having more small groups and more people connected to small groups, because we need that right now. Yeah. And giving each other, respecting that we need to make space for each other to be connecting. And then just some of those practical things: exercise, hydration, eating healthy, those types of things. We so often toss those out when we're stressed, and we actually need those more. Yeah. And so it's like, I'm stressed right now, so I'm going to stress eat. Well, you pretty much typically don't stress eat like lean chicken and broccoli. I mean, you stress eat like a bag of Doritos or whatever, and getting those things, your body is that's all tied in. Those are not the most healthy things. Yeah. So, okay. Any other things as far as just best practices when it comes to, being aware of fear? We've talked about being aware of fear. We've talked about acknowledging it so that then we can find not the bad ways of coping, but be intentional with the good ways of coping. We've listed several of those things. Mm-hmm. Any of those other good best practices we should keep in mind?
Yeah. Well, one last one is just, if you're finding that this is harder than you expected in a season, there might be a season for reaching out for counseling. And there's a lot that are doing that virtually. And so I wouldn't want to minimize that. And again, that doesn't mean that you're not handling this well. It's just you're arming yourself with another tool in your tool belt to be able to combat the negative effects of isolation and fear. And so another thing that gives us hope, and we'll kind of just land on this last best practice for combating fears, is the role of repetition and play and how that creates new pathways. So the best way for me to explain this is, as a parent, if you are disciplining a child, there's several interventions that you can use from a discipline standpoint that you might employ when wanting to change a behavior of your child, which I can't imagine any parent not coming into contact with that particular dilemma. And so what are the typical go-to strategies that we might use? You might use lecture, you might use timeouts, loss of privileges, sticker charts or positive reinforcement, different ways to change that behavior, modify it. And so if, for example, you're working with, your child, and really any age, but we'll just stick with the 4 to 6 range for now. But if you've got a behavior that needs to change, maybe you would use lecturing. Typically, with most children, but especially you're going to see the effects of this with a 4 to 6 year old, lecture is just going to go over their head. I mean, it's just not really going to be the most effective use. Some kids can. It's not that all kids can't, but it maybe isn't the most effective.
I think I think sometimes a lecture turns into intimidation. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes when a lecture is not working, it can escalate and then employ one of two things: shame or intimidation, to make the lecture stick. But of course, those are not things we want to instill in our children.
Right. So if, for example, you did a lecture and that was your only form of intervention, let's just say you would need 70 repetitions in order for you to start seeing a change in that behavior. And so that would feel a little discouraging, I think, as a parent, if you're dealing with lying every day and you lectured them for 70 times before you even start to notice a change in the behavior. I don't think any of us would want that. We'd want, okay, what's an accelerator to this process? I want to get my child to comply with expectations. So, all right, so if that 70 reps is for lecture. Let's go to the next one. What about a timeout? Well, timeout, okay, maybe, but you might need maybe 40 to 50 repetitions before you're going to start seeing that intervention being effective. Okay, so then let's go down to a loss of privilege. They lose their video game, they lose their favorite toy. For some parents, you've handicapped yourself because now they can't play with something that entertains them and hopefully is good for them. But even if it is effective, let's say you need another 25 to 40 repetitions to make that an effective strategy to start seeing a change in behavior. So what research shows is if you pair two things specifically, you can start to decrease the number of repetitions it takes to then get a new behavior change. So for example, if you access the motor memory part of their brain. So when a kid, if they're doing something, they're so much more likely to remember it. So when you talked about, Robey, just playing with the kids and scaring them, playfully, and then them having their response and fighting back or running away. And it's often met with a lot of giggles and laughter and sometimes tickling. And I know you have a doctorate, and we always tease our kids that you have a doctorate in tickling.
Yeah, they actually think to this day that my doctorate is in tickling. I'm seeing how long that lasts. All right, continue.
So we're capitalizing on that because it also releases another really important thing: laughter and play and fun. And so when those two things, the muscle memory is activated in their brain, where they're constantly repeating this cycle of being scared, but it's being disarmed, being fearful, but it's being disarmed. It's adding play into it, adding play. So when you access the motor memory with adding play, and laughter, you actually decrease the number of repetitions needed to teach a new skill down to 8 to 10 repetitions. And so now you've moved from a 70 repetition intervention down to something so much more manageable, like 8 to 10 reps, and you can start to create a new neural pathway, a new behavior in children. And I also do believe in adults too.
So we're talking about kids, and I can think about, maybe teaching a child a memory verse. If you're giving them hand motions and it's fun, they're laughing, that's going to go so much quicker. But bring that to us as adults. So we're dealing with fears. We're trying to square up to them. How do we take, because I think we can see that with kids. How would we apply that to dealing with our fears in this present circumstance? How do we apply repetitions, play, and that kind of thing to create those new pathways?
So if you only need, let's just say it would take only 8 to 10 reps to start creating a new neural pathway, and you're wanting to shut down that 6-lane pathway of ineffective coping, and you're wanting to create, okay, now in my present circumstances, I shouldn't go to that, or I can't go to that because of our limitations with the quarantine. So what do I do now? Well, creating new avenues through repetition, through play. So find a funny meme, reach out to a group of people that you've got maybe on a text chain, and bring out something that made you laugh earlier. Call a friend, get a little break in your day if you can.
So I think it's so easy to see that with kids. You see that, like, if we're going to teach kids a memory verse, for example, you do hand motions, and you'd hopefully, with each different line, and you hopefully make them laugh. But I like thinking about that for us as adults. In times of fear, what is going to be helpful for us is basically remember to play. Remember, like, these are moments where laughter is so healthy.
Yeah.
These are moments when, getting out and exercising, and, still finding ways to do the healthy activities that we need. Getting on WhatsApp chats, and, talking about something that's funny in the midst of all of this, or sharing memes that are funny. That laughter is so healthy in these kind of moments. Is that kind of the right track?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to take captive of those moments when you're feeling fearful or anxious or stressed, and you're like, but I can't do what I normally used to do. what do I do instead? Even if it's a healthy way of coping, and I can't do that right now. I can't go to my gym. I can't do this and that. So then use that as a cue of, okay, I can't do that, but I can do this. I can reach out to a friend. I can exercise. I can find a funny meme, find a way to laugh. Use that to cue you into using a new coping skill or a new regulator and creating those new connections. And that's how you can use your fears then to work to your advantage.
So as we're wrapping up this discussion, maybe just take us to a passage in Scripture that you would see that you think gives us helpful perspective on fear.
Yeah. So in 2 Kings, there's a really beautiful passage where Elisha and his servant are kind of in their place. I don't know if you want to read it for us, Robey, but they're basically there, and the servant goes outside and describe what.
Yeah, so 2 Kings 6, this is 16 and 17. 2 Kings 6, 16 and 17. He said, I'll just read verse 16 for starters. He said, so the servant comes in, he's afraid because there's armies and enemy armies and horses all around.
Right.
And that are from another country there to attack Israel. And he comes in, and the servant says to Elisha, or he says, like, look at all these soldiers. What should we do? And verse 16, Elisha responds. He said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them."
Yeah. So it sets up this beautiful picture of, okay, it's us two against this army of just opposition. And I appreciate the servant's response. What should we do? And Elisha's confidence in that those are with us are more than with them. Elisha just so gets this concept that if God can be for us, who can be against us? And a lot of times, there's a weapon that is meant to be used in our times of fear. And Ephesians 6 talks about a lot of weapons. And I think one of the underutilized weapons that we need to learn how to craft better in these seasons of fear, these moments of anxiety, is faith. And it's a beautiful faith story. And the next verse, I think, illustrates that so well.
Yeah, so verse 17, this is just one of the most powerful moments, I think, in the Old Testament. Verse 17 says, "Then Elisha prayed and said, 'O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see.' So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha."
And so it's such a beautiful thing. Elisha just says a simple prayer. Basically, he says, help him see as you see. Help him to see as you see. And when his spiritual eyes are opened, he sees the armies of the living God just encamped around them and completely intimidate what's outside their front door at that point. And I think for those of us that can't see the invisible army that's raging down from heaven right now, waiting to take up our cause, the distance between what we know to be true and what is true oftentimes is faith. And we need to exercise that faith muscle to shorten the distance between our circumstances and what we know to be true in Scripture. And a lot of times we have people in our life that are like, man, they just like handle that trial so well, or they're weathering it. Not that they're not scared, but we have people in our lives like that where we just admire the strength. And a lot of times it's the first public one that maybe we're seeing, but they didn't get there overnight. It's because they held captive all of the little battles along the way of exercising faith. They chose to believe when they couldn't see. They chose to believe that the armies of the living God were with them and for them and not against them when opposition in the flesh faced them. And I think that's such a good point to recognize, okay, the distance between what we know to be true and what we can see right now is faith.
Mm-hmm. And you were mentioning about how that also, when we were discussing this earlier, how that ends up playing out when there's the storm on the Sea of Galilee and the disciples are freaking out.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because very similar situation where there's, again, opposition. The disciples are on a boat with Jesus, and they wake him up. And Jesus' first response to them is, "Why are you so afraid? Still have you no faith?" And how Jesus ties their fears with the use of faith. And again, not to rebuke them in a way that punishes them or adds shame, but just to cue them. Hey, use your faith tool right now. You've got weapons, use them. Let's dust them off and hone them, shape them, and use them to fiercely protect us and fight back. And what's so interesting, what happens with the disciples after that, which is very similar, I feel like, with the Elisha passage, is when Jesus calms the storm, the disciples are then filled with fear and awe of Jesus. And so like the servant with Elisha and like the disciples with Jesus, they are filled with fear of Jesus, which trumps their fear of their circumstances. I heard a pastor once say it like this, like their latter fear overcame their former fear. And so whatever earthly fear that we're dealing with, when brought next to Jesus, it recoils and it loses its power and it loses its gravity because of our fear and awe of the Lord. And what does it take to activate our fear in the Lord? Well, much like it takes a lot of these interventions to turn off our fear factor physiologically that we just talked about, well, what it takes to turn on our fear of the Lord a lot of times is faith.
I think often we talk about when we're in seasons of fear, we're asking when, what, how, why is this happening to me? How am I going to get out of this? When is this all going to be over? What am I going to do? Yeah. But the number one answer is who. It's who is in control. Yeah. And so, and there's a lot of stuff we've been able to cover in this episode. Thank you for sharing all of this, working through acknowledging fear, using fear, having good practices for fear, understanding scripturally where to go with fear. Yep. Any last thoughts as we're concluding this episode?
Yeah, just let fear work to your advantage. Let fears and anxiety, when it creeps up on you, as opposed to being so distraught that, there it is again, turn it and use it for your advantage and say, okay, this is a time, it's inconvenient right now. I need to find a quick way to turn off my fear and anxiety that's been activated. It may not work perfectly or instantly every time, but if we have that 8 to 10 reps a day, then you're going to start to notice an impact on how much easier and the effectiveness of those coping skills that you can do right now. So let that cue you to start implementing some of those new strategies. Also, exercise your faith muscle, or like a muscle. Work it out like a muscle. Use it as a tool and as a weapon. When things feel or are presented to be discouraging or fearful or anxiety producing, let your faith trump that fear and your faith in what we know to be true of the Lord, and let that overwhelm your present circumstances.
So many of the helpful coping mechanisms have to do with reaching out, being honest in community, being honest with fear, enjoying those interactions, laughing together. And so if we're not active with that, we stay in isolation, we will let fear continue to build in our lives. So, hey, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the City Rev Life podcast. We will hope that you join us for the next episode.
Thank you for joining us on City Rev Life. You can subscribe to this podcast, rate and review wherever you're listening to this. And we love it when you share it with your friends on social media. For more videos and content, go ahead and check us out at cityrev.org/podcast or download our City Rev Church app. Have a great day.